In our last video, I left you with the question of how do the apoplastic and symplastic pathways differ? And hopefully you came up with the fact that the apoplastic route is entirely external to cell membranes and the symplastic route is inside of the cells. So the correct answer was what is identified as C in this slide. Now we want to talk about, so if we just go back to this idea, remember that materials can travel either apoplastically or symplastically, or they can cross membranes. So let's talk a little bit about how it is that materials can cross over plasma membranes. And first of all, you should be aware that plasma membranes are made out of lipid bilayers. So lipid bilayers have a region with the hydrophobic tails of phospholipids in the middle of the membrane. So they have a non-polar region in the interior of the membrane, and the outside of the membrane, kind of like where my knuckles would be, that here, like where my knuckles would be, those would be the hydrophilic heads. So hydrophobic interior and hydrophilic heads, and so there's water on both sides of that membrane and the membrane in between. So, so how do things get across plasma membranes? Well, the first type of transport is passive. It does not require any energy. So the cells do not have to exert any energy to have passive transport. And we've talked already about how oxygen and CO2 travel passively. The cells do not have to expend any energy. They always move from an area of high partial pressure to low partial pressure. And so, so that's a simple diffusion. If there is movement of substances from a high concentration to low concentration, and this could be movement of molecules within a fluid, like if you put a drop of water into a drop of dye into a beaker of water, and that dye gradually spreads out and fills the whole container. Or this could be movement of substances from one side of a membrane to the other side of a membrane, like we would see with oxygen diffusing from within the bloodstream through the membrane of the red blood cell. Then it would diffuse through the liquid in the blood, through the plasma in the blood, and then diffuse across the cells, including their cell membranes that line the capillary, and then would diffuse through the interstitial fluid and then diffuse into a body cell, and the oxygen would then diffuse into the mitochondrion, where it would be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. So diffusion can be either within fluids, or could be in the air as well, or it can be across a membrane. And all of that is simple diffusion. Now, if a molecule moves passively without requiring energy and from a high concentration to a low concentration, but it needs to go through a channel to get through a membrane, then we call that facilitated diffusion. Facilitated means helped. So that diffusion would be facilitated by either a channel protein or by a carrier protein. So that's facilitated diffusion, and water kind of moves this way. So a little bit of water can move across cell membranes by simple diffusion, but because water is a polar molecule, it's not very attracted to that hydrophobic environment in the middle of the membrane. So water's diffusion is much enhanced if there are little channels called aquaporins. So maybe you've heard of aquaporins before. And they're involved in facilitated diffusion of the water. Glucose often requires a little bit of help to get across the membrane, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And then, in contrast to passive transport, cells can also use active transport, where they can move substances from where they are in low concentration to where they are in higher concentration. And this requires energy because molecules are moving up their concentration gradient rather than down their concentration gradient. And so plants use active transport when they are acquiring some of the minerals from the soil, for example. And as we will see, plants use active transport to actively transport hydrogen ions, and that's really important for a lot of their transport. So, as a review of these kinds of transport, here we'll see if we can move the picture out of the way. So this figure is from chapter 7 in your textbook, and I included some tutorials from chapter 7 in your Mastering Biology homework for today. And I encourage you to watch those videos in those assignments if you need a refresher on the various kinds of transport. So notice that there are 3 kinds of passive transport shown in this figure. The first one with the purple spheres diffusing straight across the membrane without any help from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. This is simple diffusion. So just crossing a membrane without any help, simple diffusion. Whereas with these red triangles, they're still moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So they're moving down their concentration gradient, but they're moving through a channel. And then with these blue spheres, they are also moving down their concentration gradient, but in this case, they are moving through what we call a carrier protein that will change shape to allow these ions or molecules to pass through. So we have 3 kinds of passive transport. In each case, molecules or ions are moving down their concentration gradient from a higher to a lower concentration. Then over here we see active transport, which is going to move particles or ions or molecules against their concentration gradient. And the example that we see here is a very common one in animal cells, where sodium ions are being represented by the blue squares, and they're being transported from an area of low concentration outside the cell to an area of high concentration inside the cell. And in contrast, potassium ions are being represented by these circles, and they are being transported from an area where they're in low concentration inside the cell to outside the cell. So this is called the sodium and potassium pump, and it's very important in animal cells. And if you feel like you need more of a refresher, I encourage you to watch this video, the BioFlix membrane transport video that is in your textbook. You can probably find it in chapter 7. So let's just do a review question to make sure we're all on the same page with transport. Which of the following transport mechanisms requires energy?